By the time the sun rose, she would be the ugliest woman at the auction. And that was the plan. Because the alternative was for someone to recognize what she really was. Violet's hands moved in the dark over the cracked basin. The clay rim chipped where her aunt had thrown it at the wall last winter, and she worked the ash into the spoiled goat milk with the patient deliberation of a woman mixing poison for herself. The smell rose first, sour curd, wet hearth, the back of the throat sweetness of milk gone wrong, and she breathed it in on purpose, letting it settle into the wool of her shift, into the seams of her sleeves, into the soft hair at her temples. A wolf would smell this and turn away. A wolf was supposed to. She thinned the paste with a thumb, lifted it on 2 fingers, and began to paint her own face by feel, tracing false pox scars in a constellation she had practiced for 3 nights running. 1 at the edge of her jaw, 2 below the cheekbone, a crooked map across her brow. The mirror over the basin had cracked years ago, and her aunt had never replaced it. So Violet had learned to disfigure herself blind, the way a sculptor finishes a piece without looking. She could feel where her real face was under the paint, and she covered every inch of it. The luminous skin that had no right to belong to a girl of 23. The mouth her mother had given her. A line of her throat that some old bloodline insisted on making smooth and pale, and visible at a distance, the way a deer's white tail betrayed it in winter brush. Prey bait, the old women in the village had called it, before the village stopped speaking to her at all. By the time she was finished, her face felt heavier than it had any morning of her life. And that was correct, because she was about to walk down a road carrying everything she had been born to be, and everything she had agreed to pretend she wasn't. And the weight had to look right on the outside, too. Her Aunt Doria came to the doorway with a candle held too high, the flame guttering, and made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "You look like a corpse 3 days in," Doria said. "Good. The bride price for a corpse will still pay Sheldon back, won't it?" Violet didn't answer. She tied her hair back with a strip of leather and dipped the ends into the last of the spoiled milk, weighing the braid down with it until it hung wet against her shoulder blades. Doria watched her with the flat, accounting expression of a woman who had once loved her sister and had decided long ago that love was an indulgence she could no longer afford. "The debt is 6 pieces of silver and a goat," Doria said. "Anything above that is mine. Don't bargain, don't smile, don't speak unless spoken to. And for the love of every dead god, Violet, don't let one of them touch your wrist. They can read you through a pulse." "I know," Violet said. It was the first word she had spoken aloud since waking, and her voice came out rough, the way a voice does when it has spent the night swallowing. She had spent the night swallowing because that was what her body did when there was nowhere to put the grief she had taken on yesterday from old man Bailey in his last hour, his guilt over a brother drowned in a mill pond 50 years gone, his shame over a wife he had struck once and never apologized to, the small black weight of a life's accumulated unconfessed wrongs sliding out of him as he died and into her as she held his hand. He had thanked her with his last breath, and she had carried him out of the world clean. The price was that she now carried him, and the brother, and the wife, and the mill pond, and they all lived in the soft hollow under her sternum, where her own grief lived too, and where every grief she had ever taken still lived, because a sin-eater did not get to put any of it down. She had not slept. She had stood at the window watching the sky go from black to charcoal, to the bruise blue that meant the auction would happen whether she was ready or not. And she had decided that the safest place in the world for a sin-eater was inside a costume so repulsive no shifter would breathe deep enough to find her under it. She lifted the basin and tipped the rest of the paste out the window into the dirt. Doria turned from the doorway. The candle went with her. Violet stood alone in the slow gray light and pressed her palm flat over her sternum, where Bailey and the brother and the wife and the mill pond were settling in for the long haul. And she said to all of them, quietly, "I'm sorry. I'm going to need you to be quiet today." Outside, far off, a horn sounded across the moor. The cart was coming. The road to the Hollowmoors auction ground ran along a ridge that the wind had been carving for centuries, and by mid-morning, Violet was one of 43 women being walked along it in a loose, unhappy procession, hands not bound, but understood to be unfree. Some of the others had been dressed by mothers or sisters in the best a poorhouse could offer. A clean-dyed linen here, a borrowed silver pin there, a braid arranged with a kind of doomed hopefulness. Two girls toward the front were openly weeping. One older woman in the middle, perhaps 30, wore the resigned face of someone who had been to 2 of these before and had not been chosen, and was beginning to suspect she might be safer for it. Violet kept her head down. The paint on her face had begun to crack at the corners of her mouth, and she could feel flakes of it shifting when she breathed. The smell of the spoiled milk traveled with her in a small private cloud, and the women immediately around her had given her a wide berth within the first half-mile, which was exactly what she had paid for. Better to be the leper of the procession than the prize. She listened to the talk around her without lifting her eyes. The Alpha King would be there in person this season, a girl ahead of her was whispering. Ash himself. He hadn't come to an auction in 4 years. Not since the last one where he'd walked the whole line and chosen no one, and left in a temper that had made the council elders go gray overnight. He came every year before that, the older woman said, in a voice that had gone past gossip and into something almost reverent. Every year since he was crowned. Walks the line, smells every one of us, picks no one. They say he's looking for a particular scent. They say he's looking for a ghost. They say a lot of things, Violet thought, and none of them are my business as long as he keeps walking. She kept her face down and her shoulders curved inward, and made herself small in the way a person can only make themselves small when they have practiced it for years. The auction ground when they arrived was not what she had imagined. She had pictured a market square. It was instead a wide bowl of trampled grass at the foot of a hill of standing stones, the stones black with weather and lichen, the grass turned to mud by the boots of the men already gathered along the far edge. A wooden platform ran the length of the bowl, and the women were walked up onto it one by one and arranged in a line facing outward, and Violet found herself between the resigned older woman and a girl perhaps 16 who would not stop trembling. She wanted to take the girl's hand. She did not, because Doria's voice was still in her ear about wrists and pulses, and because her own hand under the paint was the hand of a sin-eater, and to touch the girl now would be to begin reading her without consent. So she stood. She stared at the mud at the foot of the platform. She breathed shallowly through her mouth so the spoiled milk smell would not turn her own stomach. And she waited to be passed over. The men came along the line slowly. She heard them before she saw them. Boots on packed earth, the low murmur of consultation, the occasional sharp inhale of a wolf testing a scent and finding it interesting. She felt one of them pause in front of the older woman beside her, and she felt the older woman flinch in a way that was not refusal, but was not welcome either. She heard a price spoken. She heard the older woman walk off the platform. The line shifted. She kept her eyes on the mud. Then she felt the air change. It was not the air exactly. It was the way the air carried a person. Whoever had stopped in front of her was tall enough that she could see the shadow of him on the platform boards before she saw the boots, and the boots, when they came into her downcast view, were not new and not ostentatious. Dark leather, well worn, the kind a man wore because he walked in them, not because he wanted to be admired in them. He did not speak. He did not move. He breathed in. He breathed in again, slower. And then she heard him say, very quietly, in a voice that was lower and warmer than she had braced for, and that carried no triumph in it at all, only a kind of exhausted recognition. There you are. Violet's head came up before she could stop it. The man in front of her was not what the gossip had built. He was tall, yes, broad through the shoulders, dark-haired, with a jaw that had been broken once and set imperfectly, so that one side of his mouth sat a little lower than the other. His eyes were the color of riverbed stone. There was a tiredness to him that she felt in her own chest before her mind had assembled it, as if her sternum had recognized something her face had not yet caught up to. He looked at her painted, ash-smeared, milk-soured face, and his expression did not move. He looked at her like a man looking at a window he had been searching for, in a house he had been walking the corridors of for 11 years. "I'll take this one," Ash said, to no one in particular, and the bond clerk at the end of the platform began writing before anyone thought to argue. The price he paid was almost insulting in its size, 3 times what Doria had hoped for, paid in clean coin out of a leather purse he did not seem to count, handed to the clerk with the absent courtesy of a man settling a bar tab. Violet did not see Doria in the crowd and was glad of it. She was walked off the platform with Ash's hand at her elbow, not gripping, only resting, and even through the wool of her sleeve she could feel the heat of him and the careful restraint of how lightly he was holding her, as if he had measured exactly how little pressure it would take to guide her without bruising, and was applying that and no more. He did not look at her again as they walked. He did not speak to her. He spoke once, briefly, to a gray-bearded man at the edge of the auction ground, who Violet would later learn was his steward, a man named Sheldon. Not her aunt's Sheldon, a different one. A Hollowmore's Sheldon, with a face like a kind, weathered cliff. And what Ash said to him was, the green carriage, not the gold. Discreet. Now. Sheldon did not ask why. Sheldon went. The carriage that came for them was, in fact, green, and so unremarkable that Violet would not have looked at it twice on a road. The interior smelled of cedar and old leather, and very faintly of dog, which she would only understand later. Ash handed her up into it with the same careful, measured touch he had used on her elbow, and he sat down across from her, not beside her, and he closed the door himself rather than waiting for the footman. And then he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped between them, and he looked at her properly for the first time. There was no hunger in his face. There was no possession. There was a stillness that she recognized because she had worn it herself on the long nights after a sin eating. The stillness of a person carrying something they could not put down and trying not to slosh it. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. His voice in the small space of the carriage was even lower than it had been on the platform, and it had a roughness to it that suggested he did not use it often. "I know what you are. I knew the moment I stepped close enough. The paint was good, the milk was clever. Whoever taught you to do that loved you once. But under it, your grief is the cleanest thing I have smelled in 11 years. And I would have known it from across the field." Violet did not answer. She sat with her painted hands folded in her painted lap, and she watched him. The carriage began to move. He went on. "My mother was the last sin-eater the Hollowmoors knew. Her name was Mira. My father had her killed when I was 9 because she would not take his sins out of him, and he could not stand to die unclean. So he made certain she died first instead, which is the kind of logic a guilty man considers reasonable. I have spent 11 years walking auction lines looking for her bloodline because I believed, correctly it turns out, that someone had survived. I am not going to ask you to take my father's sins. I am not going to ask you to take mine. I bought you because the only place in this country where a sin eater is safe is behind my name, and I am offering you that name as a roof, not as a leash. The contract we sign tonight will say one thing. I will never ask you to swallow my sins. Do you understand the shape of that vow? Violet's hands had begun to tremble. She put one over the other to still them. Why? She said, and her voice came out smaller than she had intended.
Why would you not ask?
He looked at her steadily. Because I know what it would cost you, he said. My father's sins are sitting on me. They have been sitting on me since the day he died unrepentant, and they are spreading. I will be dead inside 2 years, possibly less. A sin eater could lift them. I know this. I have read every account my mother left, and I also know that the weight of what is on me would not pass through you and out into the air. It would settle into you, the way every sin you have ever taken has settled into you. And on top of what you already carry, it would stop your heart inside a season, probably faster. So no, I am not going to ask. Violet's mouth had gone dry. Outside the carriage window, the moor was rolling past, gray-green and endless, and somewhere behind them the auction ground was already emptying. Then why marry me at all? She said. He almost smiled. It was a small, tired thing, only one corner of his crooked mouth, and it did not reach his eyes, but it was the first softness she had seen on him. Because the council will not let me die without an heir on paper, he said, and a bond right with you satisfies the paperwork. Because if I do not claim you publicly, someone else will buy you next season, and they will not know what you are or how to keep you alive. And because... He stopped. He looked at his hands. Because my mother died alone, he said more quietly. And I would like, before I go, to give one of her bloodline a place where she is not alone. The carriage rocked on. Violet realized she had not breathed in some time. She made herself breathe. She felt, in the soft hollow under her sternum, a quiet weight settling, as if someone had handed her a grief that was finally hers to carry. And she understood, with the clarity that only a sin-eater could have, that what had just settled there was not Bailey, and not the brother, and not the mill pond. It was Ash. She had not meant to read him. She had not touched his wrist. But he had spoken his grief out loud in a closed space, and she had been built, from the womb, to receive such things, and now part of him sat in her chest and would not be put down. He saw something change in her face. He frowned. What? He said. Nothing, she said. Her own voice surprised her with how steady it came out. You said the rite is tonight. He nodded. And I should wash my face, she said. The faintest breath of a laugh escaped him, surprised out of him, and he sat back against the carriage wall and looked at her with something that was almost wonder. Yes, he said, that would be acceptable. The Hollowmoors Keep was not a castle in the storybook sense. It was a long, low fortress of gray stone built into the side of a hill, with thick walls and narrow windows, and a great hall that smelled of wood smoke and beeswax and, faintly, of lavender, from whatever the housekeepers were drying in the rafters. Ash brought her in through a side door, not the main one, and the few servants they passed did not gawk because the few servants they passed had been told, by a single look from him, not to. He brought her up a back stair to a set of rooms that were warmer than she had expected. A small sitting room with a banked fire, a bedchamber beyond it with a deep tub already steaming behind a screen, and on a low table by the fire, a tray of food that someone had clearly been instructed to lay out the moment the green carriage was sighted on the road. Bread still warm, soft cheese, a bowl of stewed apples, a pitcher of water, and the smaller pitcher of something darker that smelled of honey and herbs. He stopped at the threshold. He did not come inside. "The bath is yours," he said. "The food is yours. The rooms are yours, for as long as you want them. There is a bell pull by the bed. If you ring it, a woman named Bailey will come. She is the only person on this hall I trust with what you are, and she has already been told to ask you no questions. The right is at the 11th bell. I will come for you myself. If you have changed your mind by then, you may say so, and the right will not happen, and you will still keep the rooms and the name and the protection. Do you understand?" Violet nodded. He inclined his head once and stepped back and pulled the door closed between them so gently she did not hear the latch catch. She stood in the middle of the sitting room for a long moment, in her ash and her milk and her painted scars, and she felt the silence of the place close around her like water. Then she went to the tub. The water was almost too hot. She made herself get in anyway. The paint came off in long gray runnels that turned the water the color of a dirty river, and the spoiled milk smell rose up out of her hair as it loosened, and she scrubbed and scrubbed until her scalp stung. When the water was nearly black, she pulled the plug and let it drain, and refilled it from the kettle on the hearth, and got back in and scrubbed again. She did this 3 times. When she finally stepped out the water, and the tub was almost clear, and her skin was raw, and her hair, dripping, was the pale ash blonde her mother had given her, and her face, in the small hand mirror beside the basin, was, undeniably, the face she had spent the morning hiding. She looked at it for a long time. She had not seen it without paint, or dirt, or a deliberate smudge of soot in nearly 4 years. It was, the way her aunt had once spat at her, prey bait. It was also her mother's. Bailey, the housekeeper Bailey, not the dead old man Bailey. She would have to learn to keep them separate in her head. Knocked once and entered with an armful of folded clothes and a small covered bowl. She was perhaps 60, broad and unhurried, with gray hair pinned in a knot and the sharp, clean smell of someone who worked with herbs. She looked at Violet's bare, scrubbed face without any visible reaction. She set the clothes on the bed. She set the bowl on the washstand. "There's salve for your scalp," she said. "The milk you used eats at the skin if you leave it. The dress is the simplest one I could find. The king said simple. He said no jewels and no veil and nothing that made you feel owned. Those were his words." "Thank you," Violet said. Bailey paused at the door. "There's a creature," she said, "in the back kitchens. A dog, half blind. The old king kicked it the year before he died and broke something inside it that never set right. Our king kept it alive on scraps and warm bricks because he could not bear another small thing dying in this house. I mention it because the dog will find you tonight or tomorrow. It finds anyone the king brings in, and I want you to know it is not a threat. Its name is Moth." "Moth," Violet repeated. Bailey nodded once and left. Violet dressed alone in the dim, fire-warm room, in a gown of soft gray wool that fell to her ankles and tied at the waist with a plain cord. And she sat down on the edge of the bed and tried to breathe around the new weight in her chest. She had been in this house less than 2 hours. She had a husband-to-be who was dying of his father's sins and refused her the only thing she had been born to do. She had a name she had not yet earned and a roof she had not yet trusted. And in the soft hollow under her sternum, the grief that was ash sat companionably beside the grief that was Bailey, the dead man and the brother and the wife and the mill pond. And it did not feel like a burden. It felt, terrifyingly, like company. The 11th bell rang too soon. He came for her himself, as he had promised. and he had changed only insofar as he had put on a darker coat and combed his hair. And when he saw her without the paint, his face did something she would replay later in the dark. A slight, involuntary tightening at the corners of the eyes, as if she had hit him low and he was deciding not to show it. He offered her his arm. He did not comment on her face. He walked her down the back stair and through a covered passage and out into a small inner courtyard where a single old yew tree grew out of a circle of stones. And under the yew tree, 2 witnesses waited, Sheldon the steward and Bailey the housekeeper, and a thin old woman in a gray robe whose eyes were milky with cataracts, and who was, Violet would learn, the keep's last bond priest. There was no crowd. There was no music. There was a small fire burning in a brazier at the foot of the yew, and the air smelled of yew resin and wood smoke and, very faintly, of him. Warm skin, leather, something underneath that her sin-eater senses read as grief-wrought, the slow spread of his father's unabsolved sins eating him from the inside. And she had to lock her knees not to step into him and put her hands on his chest and pull. The old priest spoke the words. Ash spoke the vows. He spoke them clearly and slowly, and he did not look away from her face. And when the moment came for the line that should have bound her to take his burdens as her own, he spoke instead the line he had promised her in the carriage. I will never ask you to swallow my sins. The old priest did not flinch. The old priest, Violet realized, had been told. Sheldon and Bailey did not flinch either. The vow held. The fire in the brazier flared once, a clean white spike, and settled, which was the old sign that a true bond had been recognized, by whatever in the world recognized such things. Ash leaned forward and pressed his forehead to hers, very briefly, and she felt the heat of him, and the grief of him, and the bone-deep tiredness of him, and she closed her eyes and did not pull. He did not bite her neck. That, too, he had told her in the carriage, would wait. The rite ended. They walked back through the covered passage in silence. At the door of her rooms, he stopped and looked down at her and said, in a voice that had gone almost unsteady, "Thank you for not running." Then he went to his own door, 2 down the hall, and closed it behind him. Violet stood in her doorway alone, married, untouched, and she pressed her palm flat to the hollow under her sternum and felt, with a clarity that frightened her, that he had not closed the door fully between them at all. She did not sleep that night, and neither, she suspected, did he. She heard him moving in the room 2 doors down, a chair pulled across stone, a window opened and closed, the creak of a floorboard near the hearth. At intervals across the small dark hours, and each time she heard him she felt, in the new soft place in her chest, the corresponding shift of his unease. It was not thought-sharing. It was nothing so clean as that. It was the way a person who shared a bed could feel the other person turn over in the dark without waking. She had read about bonds in the few books her mother had left her, the careful diagrams and the careful warnings, and none of them had prepared her for the simple domestic strangeness of lying alone in a strange bed and feeling another person's exhaustion as if it were weather in the room. Sometime past the second bell after midnight, she heard a small scratching at her door. She went to it in her bare feet and opened it a crack. There was no one in the corridor. She looked down. Moth was a wolfhound the size of a small pony and the color of dirty snow, with 1 milky eye and 1 good amber one, and a notch torn out of the left ear, and the careful, low-tucked posture of an animal that had spent its whole life being kicked and was no longer quite sure whether to expect it from new people. He sat in her doorway. He did not push in. He looked at her with the good eye and waited. Violet knelt down on the cold stone, slowly, the way a sin-eater learned to kneel beside a dying body, and she held out the back of her hand for him to smell. He smelled it. He smelled it for a long time. And then, very gently, he leaned the great bony plate of his skull into her palm and closed his eyes. She did not understand at first why she was crying. Then she understood that for 9 years, no creature with a nose for what she was had let her touch it. And she had not realized until this moment that she had stopped reaching out. She brought him into her room. He lay down on the rug in front of the fire as if he had been doing it his whole life. She lay down beside him with her cheek on his ribs and her hand in the rough fur of his neck. And the second to last thing she felt before she finally slept was his slow, patient heartbeat. And the very last thing she felt was the quiet weight in her sternum settling around the shape of him, too. As if her body had decided that the dog was hers now. And that was that. She woke at first light with Moth's nose against her forehead and a soft knock at her sitting room door. Bailey with breakfast, and behind Bailey, hovering in the doorway like a man unsure whether he was permitted, Ash. He had not slept. She could see it in his face, and she could feel it in the new place under her sternum. And the two confirmations together gave her an information she did not yet know how to use. "May I come in?" he said. "Yes," she said. Bailey laid the tray on the low table by the fire and withdrew without a word. Moth lifted his head, considered the king, thumped his tail twice against the rug, and went back to sleep. Ash looked at the dog. A muscle moved in his jaw. "He sleeps in the kitchen," Ash said. "He has not slept on a rug by a fire since my father broke his hip." "He came to the door," Violet said. "I let him in." "I am glad," Ash said. He sat down in the chair across from hers, slowly, the way a man sat down when sitting down hurt. She poured him a cup of the dark honey and herb drink without asking. He took it. He held it between his hands and did not drink it. He looked into the fire. "There is something I did not tell you yesterday," he said. Violet waited. "The rot," he said. "My father's sins. They are spreading faster than I told you. I said 2 years. I was being generous to myself. The healers say 4 months, possibly 5 if the winter is mild. I tell you this because we have signed a contract and you are entitled to the truth of what you have signed into." Violet set down her own cup. The new weight in her chest was very still. "I can lift them," she said quietly. He looked up. His Riverstone eyes were level. "We have had this conversation," he said. "We had it yesterday, and the answer has not changed." "I am not asking, I am offering," she said. "There is a difference." "Violet," he said. Her name in his mouth was the first time he had used it, and it was not a caress. It was a warning, slow and careful and absolute. "If you take them, you die. I have read every account my mother left, and I have spoken to 2 old women in the eastern villages who remember her work, and the verdict is the same in every source. The weight that is on me would kill a sin-eater of full strength inside a season. You have already taken," he glanced at her chest, not at her body, but at the place under her sternum, as if he could see it. "You have already taken a great deal. Whatever you are carrying right now is most of what your kind can carry and still walk. You do not have room for my father in you. You would not survive the swallow." "Then we find another way," she said. He shook his head. "There is no other way. The bloodline rules of your kind say a sin must be taken into a living body or burned out by a death, and the bloodline rules of mine say a king who dies unabsolved passes the rot to his heir, which I do not have, which means it will simply die with the line, which is acceptable. It is not acceptable to me, she said. The words came out before she had decided to say them. He looked at her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire snapped. Moth sighed in his sleep. Why? Ash said finally. The honest answer was that he had spoken his grief in a closed carriage, and her body had taken it in, and now part of him lived in her chest, and she could not, would not, watch a part of herself die in 4 months because the rules of 2 old peoples said the only options were her death or his. The honest answer was that she had spent her whole life being told her gift was a curse, and she was tired, suddenly and completely, of agreeing with that assessment. The honest answer was that she had touched a half-blind dog last night, and the dog had let her, and a small, unreasonable hope had cracked open in her, and she did not yet know how to put it down. She said none of these things. She said, "Because you are the first person in 9 years who has looked at me and not flinched. And because I would like to be in a world that has you in it for longer than 4 months. And because I do not believe the rules are as fixed as our peoples have agreed to believe." He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were wet, just at the corners, and he did not let it go further than that. "We will not have this conversation again," he said. "We will," she said. He almost smiled. The crooked corner of his mouth lifted and then gave up. "We will," he agreed. Then he stood, slowly, painfully, and bowed his head to her once, and left her with the dog and the fire and the cooling drink in her hands. The second day passed in a strange and terrible quiet. Ash was called away to council in the morning, and Violet, left to her own devices, did what she had always done in unfamiliar houses. She made herself useful in small, invisible ways. She helped Bailey in the still room, sorting dried herbs. She walked the inner courtyard with Moth limping beside her and learned the pattern of the old yew shadow across the stones. She read, slowly, in the small library off the great hall, 3 of the brittle old accounts Ash's mother had left, looking for the loophole that everyone had agreed did not exist. She did not find it. What she found instead was Mira's handwriting. Careful, slanting, the same loop on the lowercase g that Violet's own mother had made, and a note written in the margin of the longest account that read, in Mira's hand, "The rule says taken into a body or burned out by a death, but it does not say whose body, and it does not say whose death. And I have wondered all my life whether the rule was written narrow on purpose by someone who did not want us to look further." Violet read the note 3 times. She copied it onto a scrap of paper and folded it into the bodice of her dress. She did not yet know what to do with it. She knew only that someone had left it for her across 40 years and 2 graves, and that she would be a fool not to listen. The afternoon brought visitors. A delegation from one of the southern vassal communities, in for the season's tributes, was being put up in the east wing, and word had spread through the keep that the king had taken a wife at the auction, and curiosity was thick enough to choke on. Bailey warned her. Violet did not go down to dinner. Ash did not insist. But late in the afternoon, while Violet was in the library, the door opened without a knock, and a woman swept in who did not belong in any library Violet had ever been in. She was tall, dark-haired, beautifully dressed in deep red, with the particular polished poise of a woman who had been raised from the cradle to be queen of somewhere, and had not yet decided where. Her name, she informed Violet without being asked, was Lady Cassara of the Eastern Reach, and she was a cousin of the king's mother's house, and she had been promised, she repeated, in the tone of someone who had heard the promise from her own father every birthday for 20 years, to Ash since they were children. She had come, she said, to congratulate the new bride. Her smile was very white and did not move her eyes. Violet, who had spent her life reading the grief under polite faces, read under this one in less than 3 breaths. Cassara's grief was thin and sharp and almost entirely composed of thwarted ambition, and underneath it sat something colder that Violet did not at first have a name for. They spoke for perhaps 10 minutes. Cassara asked in a voice of bright concern after Violet's family, her village, her health. She mentioned in passing that the king's color was not good and that the council was so worried. And was it true that he had not yet taken a healer to his bedchamber to look him over properly? Violet said only what she had to say and as little of it as possible. Cassara left with another white smile and a touch to Violet's arm that lingered just long enough to be a measurement. The moment the door closed, Violet sat down hard in the library chair and put her hand over the place under her sternum where Ash's grief lived, and discovered that her own hand was shaking. Cassara had wanted to take her wrist. Cassara had not, because Violet had kept both hands wrapped around a book. But Cassara had wanted to, and the wanting had been not curious but appraising, the way a buyer in a market touched fruit to see how soft it was. And Violet understood with a clean, cold certainty that Cassara already suspected what she was, and was deciding what to do about it. She told Ash that night. He came to her sitting room after the 11th bell, as he had the night before, and this time he sat on the rug beside Moth instead of in the chair, and he listened to her describe Cassara without interrupting, and when she finished, he closed his eyes for a long moment and said, very quietly, "I have been a fool. She has been at court for 2 months. I assumed her father had sent her in case I died without naming an heir, and she meant to position herself for the council vote. I did not consider that she might also know or guess what my mother was, and what that means for me." He opened his eyes. "Violet," he said, "if she has guessed what you are, and she has guessed what is on me, she may try to use you." "Use me," Violet said. "To take my father's sins out of me," he said, "without my consent, without yours. Because a sin-eating done under duress still works. The rot still leaves the host, and the eater still dies. And if I am alive and clean, and you are dead, the marriage is dissolved, and the council will need a new queen quickly, and there is one already in the keep with the right bloodline waiting to be useful." He said it flatly, as if reading a contract aloud, but his hand on Moth's neck had gone still in a way that Violet recognized, and she felt under her sternum the sudden hot spike of his fear, which was not for himself. "She would have to touch me," Violet said slowly, working it out. "She would have to get my hands on you while you were too weak to refuse." "She would have to drug me," Ash said. "Or you. Or both." Violet thought about Cassara's outstretched hand, about the lingering touch on her arm, about the cup of wine Cassara had not, in the end, offered her, but had certainly considered. She thought about Mira's handwriting in the margin, and the words, "taken into a body," or "burned out by a death," and it does not say whose. She thought about a small, half-blind dog who had lived because Ash had quietly fed him scraps for years. She made a decision. She did not tell him what the decision was. She said, instead, "We should not sleep apart tonight." He looked at her. She felt the question in his face before he asked it. "Not for that," she said. "For safety. If she comes for either of us in the dark, she will come for whichever of us is alone first, and I would rather we make her work for both of us at once." Ash was quiet for a long time. Then he stood, slowly, and held out his hand to her, palm up, the way a man held out his hand to a horse he did not want to startle. "Come to my rooms," he said. "The bed is bigger, and the door is heavier, and there is only one window, and it does not open. Violet took his hand. It was the first time their bare skin had touched. She felt, in the soft hollow under her sternum, nothing new, because he was already there, and she felt, in her actual fingers, the warm, calloused weight of him, and she felt in his fingers a small involuntary tightening, and then a deliberate loosening, and she understood that he was as careful with her body as he was with everything else he loved, and was trying not to break. His rooms were larger than hers and emptier. A great hearth, a wide bed under a dark wool canopy, a desk piled with the unfinished work of a king who had been pacing himself toward death. He banked the fire higher. He bolted the door. He sat down on the edge of the bed in his shirt and trousers, boots off, and he watched her with a stillness that was not invitation, but was not refusal either. Moth had followed them. Moth lay across the threshold like a barricade. Violet sat down beside him, close enough that her knee touched his, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then she said, "I want to try something." He went very still. "Not what you are thinking," she said, "though I am also thinking it. Something else first. I want to put my hand on your chest, not to take anything, only to listen. I have been listening through the bond all day in pieces, and I want a fuller picture before tomorrow. May I?" He nodded once. She turned to face him and laid her palm flat over his sternum, over the linen of his shirt, where her own sternum carried him. She closed her eyes. She listened the way she had been taught, the way her mother had taught her, on a winter night when she was 11, with her breath slow and her own grief quiet, and her attention narrowed to the thread of another person's interior weather. What she heard in him was worse than she had braced for. The rot was a slow black spread under his ribs, a sludge that moved when you breathed, with edges that crumbled into him and reformed. It was not a single sin. It was the accumulated, unrepented life of a cruel man, and it was eating his own tissue to fuel its spread, and the healers had been generous. He had perhaps 3 months. She did not say this aloud. She kept her hand where it was. She let her own breath synchronize with his, and she did the thing Mira's note had cracked open in her. She did not try to take the rot into herself. She tried, instead, to find the edges of it and to learn its shape, to map it, because a thing with edges could be moved, and a thing that could be moved did not have to be moved into her. When she opened her eyes, he was looking at her with an expression she did not have a word for. "What did you do?" he said. His voice had gone hoarse. "Nothing yet," she said. "I was looking." He covered her hand with his own and held it against his chest, and she felt under her palm the slow, steady drum of his living heart, and under her sternum the new weight of him settling deeper. And she leaned forward without deciding to, and put her forehead against his, the way he had done at the right. "Violet," he said. "The vow holds," she said. "I am not going to swallow them. I promise you that. But I am not going to let you die either. I have an idea, and I need a day to work it out, and I need you to not argue with me about it tonight." He laughed. It was a real laugh, low and surprised, and a little broken at the edges, and it was the most beautiful sound she had heard in 9 years. "You are extraordinary," he said. "I know," she said, and she surprised herself by meaning it. Then he kissed her. It was not the kiss the books had prepared her for. It was slow and questioning and very warm, and his hand came up to cup the side of her face with the same measured, careful pressure he had used on her elbow the day before, and she felt every place his mouth touched hers as a small bright revelation, and she felt under her sternum the grief of him ease, just slightly, just for the duration of the kiss, and she understood that this too was a kind of medicine, and it was permitted. He pulled back first. He pressed his forehead to hers again. "We should sleep," he said. "We should," she agreed. They did not. They lay down together fully clothed under the dark wool canopy with moth across the door and the fire banked low, and they talked, in the slow drifting way of two people who had decided to trust each other and were still feeling out the edges of what that meant. He told her about his mother, the way she had braided his hair when he was small, the song she had hummed when she was thinking, the morning she had been taken from the keep, and the afternoon she had not come back. He told her about the 11 years of auctions, the faces he had walked past, the one girl in the 3rd year who had almost been right and had turned out to be a half-blood with no gift, and who he had quietly given a dowry to and sent home. He told her about Moth, the kick, the broken hip, the way he had carried the dog into the back kitchen in his own arms at 16 and told the cook, "This one lives." And the cook had not argued with him, because even then, he had been the kind of boy people did not argue with when his face went a certain way. She told him about her mother, about Doria, about Bailey the dying old man, and the mill pond, and the brother, about the village that had stopped speaking to her, about painting her face that morning by feel because there was no mirror, about the moment in the carriage when his grief had settled into her chest and she had known, with the clarity only her kind had, that he was going to be hers whether either of them wanted it or not. Sometime in the small hours she fell asleep, with her cheek on his shoulder, and his hand loose in her hair, and Moth's slow breathing rising and falling at the door, and she dreamed of Mira's handwriting in the margin, and she dreamed of edges, and she dreamed of fire that burned clean instead of consuming. She woke before dawn with the answer fully formed in her mind. She sat up slowly so as not to wake him. She slid out from under his arm. She went to the desk and she found a clean sheet of paper, and she wrote it down, all of it, in the same slanting hand her mother had used and her mother's mother before her, while the words were still hot. "Taken into a body or burned out by a death," Mira had written. It does not say whose body, and it does not say whose death. The rot was a thing with edges. A thing with edges could be lifted out of one body and held in the open air for the length of a breath, and then driven into a thing that was already dying. Not a person, a thing. Something that the rot could anchor in long enough to be consumed when the thing died. And there was a thing in this keep that was already dying, because Bailey the housekeeper had told her so on her first night, in the careful, kind voice of a woman who had been giving the news for years. The old yew in the inner courtyard, the one under which they had spoken their vows, was hollowing from the inside and would not last another 2 winters. The yew was already dying. The yew was rooted in the ground that had heard their bond. The yew would take the rot the way it had taken every storm the moor had thrown at it for 600 years, and it would carry the rot down into itself as it died, and the rot would die with it, and Ash would live, and Violet would not have to swallow a single black drop of his father into her own body. She would only have to be the channel for the breath of time it took to move the rot from him to the tree. She would not even have to take it in. She would have to hold it. She read what she had written. She read it again. She folded the paper and put it in the bodice of her dress, beside Mira's note. She did not wake him. She let him sleep, because he had not slept properly in months, and possibly years, and because she wanted, badly, to let him have one more morning before she told him what she meant to do. She did not get the morning. She was sitting at his desk in the gray pre-dawn light, watching him sleep and rehearsing how to say it, when Moth lifted his head from the threshold and growled, low, deep, the kind of sound a wolfhound made when something was wrong on the other side of a door. Violet went still. The growl came again. She crossed to the door silently in her bare feet, and she put her ear to the wood. There were footsteps in the corridor. More than one set. Moving carefully, the way people moved when they did not want to be heard. She turned and crossed the room in 3 long strides and shook Ash's shoulder. He came awake the way a man came awake who had been a soldier, entirely and at once and without sound. She put her finger to her lips. He nodded. He was on his feet and pulling on his boots in the time it took her to lift the iron poker from the hearth. The door was barred from the inside. She heard, very faintly, the scrape of metal on metal at the lock. She heard a low voice in the corridor that was Cassara's voice, pitched for the ears of whoever she had brought with her, and she was saying, "The king has been ill. The door is stuck. We are entering as a courtesy to check on his health." The bar would hold for perhaps a minute. Ash crossed to her. He did not speak. He took the poker out of her hand and replaced it with a long knife from a sheath inside his coat that she had not known was there. And he took up a heavier blade for himself, and he positioned her behind him against the wall beside the door so that whoever came through would see him first, and not her. "Stay behind me," he breathed. "Violet, I mean it. Whatever happens, stay." Moth had risen and stood beside Ash with his hackles up and his good eye fixed on the door, and the 3 of them waited in the long, slow second before the bar gave. It gave with a crack. The door slammed open. 2 men came through fast, drawn weapons, and behind them, Cassara, in her red dress with a small glass vial in her hand. The men were big and quick and clearly paid, and they came for Ash because Ash was the obvious threat. And Ash met them with the particular efficient violence of a king who had not lived this long by being slow. One man went down inside 3 seconds with a knife in the hollow of his throat. The second man got a slash across Ash's ribs before Moth, all 80 pounds of half-blind wolfhound and remembered grievance, hit him sideways at the knees and brought him down screaming, and Ash finished him with the heavy blade. It took perhaps 11 seconds in total. In the silence after, Cassara stood very still in the doorway, with the vial held up between them, and her face was no longer beautiful. It was the face of a woman who had budgeted for a different morning. "Don't," she said. "He is bleeding." "He is going to keep bleeding. I have what your kind needs to lift the rot. The proper rite, the proper words. You do not have to do it raw. You can do it clean. You can save him. Only come here. Only come and take it from me, and you can save him." She was talking to Violet. She had stopped looking at Ash entirely. She was talking very fast, the way a person talked when their plan had gone sideways and they were trying to repair it on the run. And Violet understood, in the cold, clear part of her mind that her kind kept for moments like this, that the vial in Cassara's hand was almost certainly a Sin-Eater's draft, the old preparation, the one her mother's books described, that opened a Sin-Eater's body wide enough to take in twice what they could otherwise hold. Drink it and Violet would be able to swallow Ash's father's rot in a single pull. Drink it, and Violet would be dead inside an hour. Cassara would be queen by sundown. Violet stepped out from behind Ash. "Violet," he said sharply, and she heard the new edge in his voice that was fear for her and not for himself. She put her hand on his arm without taking her eyes off Cassara. "I am not drinking it," she said quietly. Cassara's face flickered. "He is bleeding," Cassara said again. "He is going to die in your arms in an hour from blood loss alone, you stupid girl. Never mind the rot. And the only way to save him is to take the rot off him so his body can heal the cut. And you cannot take the rot raw. You will die before you finish. You have to drink it." She was right about one thing. Ash's side was bleeding badly. Violet could see it now. The dark spread through his shirt, the way he was holding his weight slightly off-center. The rot in him would slow the healing. The cut would kill him if the rot stayed. Cassara had not planned for the bodyguards to fail, but she had planned for everything that came after, including this. And she had walked into the corridor knowing that if she could just get the vial into Violet's hands, the rest of the morning would arrange itself. Violet looked at Ash. She looked at Moth, whose muzzle was bloody and whose body was placed deliberately between her and the door. She looked at the open window across the room that looked out over the inner courtyard, where the old yew tree stood in the gray light, with its hollow heart and its 600 years of weathered patience. She did not need the draft. She had a better plan. She had written it down an hour ago, and it was folded in her bodice. She turned back to Cassara. "Put the vial down," she said. Cassara laughed, high and brittle. "You think I am going to—" Violet moved, not toward Cassara, toward Ash. She stepped into him, fast, and put both her hands flat against his chest over the wound. And she closed her eyes, and she did the thing she had practiced in her mind all night. She found the edges of the rot, every black, crumbling edge of it, and she lifted. She did not pull it into herself. She held it suspended at the surface of his skin, between her palms, the way a person held a handful of water that desperately wanted to spill. And she felt under her sternum the immediate burning protest of her own gift, which had been built to take such things in and was being asked to do something it had never been asked to do, which was to hold and not absorb. She felt her bond with him flare hot. She felt his body, for the first time in 11 years, begin to seal a wound at proper speed. She felt the rot press against her palms, hungry, looking for entry, and she did not let it in. "Hold on to me," she said through her teeth. He did. His hands closed around her upper arms, hard. She turned them, both of them, with the rot held between her hands like a captive thing, toward the open window. Cassara, behind them, made a sound that was almost a scream, because Cassara had read enough of the same books to understand that whatever Violet was doing was not in any of them. Violet walked, slowly, the 4 steps to the window. She leaned out. The yew was directly below, its great hollow trunk gaping open on the courtyard side where the heartwood had rotted away naturally, a dark mouth in the gray wood. Violet opened her hands. She did not push. She did not throw. She simply let go, with intention, the way a sin-eater learned to let go of a grief once it had been received and processed. And she directed the letting go downward, into the hollow of the tree. The rot fell. It fell the way smoke fell in still air, slowly, with weight, and it slid down the gray morning and into the dark mouth of the yew, and the yew took it the way the yew had taken every storm for 600 years, without comment. And the air in the courtyard for one long moment smelled of yew resin and old grief and something burning clean. Then it smelled of nothing. The rot was gone. Ash sagged against her. She turned and caught him as well as she could, which was not very well, because he was twice her weight. But Moth was already there bracing his other side, and the 3 of them went down together in a slow, controlled collapse onto the rug. Ash's hand came up and found her face. He looked at her. His river-stone eyes were clear in a way she had not seen them, not even once, since she had met him. "Violet," he said, "you are still here." "Yes," she said. She was crying. She had not noticed when she had started. "I am still here." "The vial held," Ash said. "You did not swallow them." "No," she said. "I did not." Behind them in the doorway, Cassara was still standing with the useless vial in her hand, and her face the color of old paper. She had been so focused on Violet's hands on Ash's chest that she had not noticed Sheldon the steward and 3 of the household guard arriving silently behind her in the corridor, summoned by Bailey, who had heard the door give. They took Cassara without a struggle. She did not fight. She had budgeted for a different morning, and the budget had run out. She was led away. Sheldon, before he followed, stepped into the room and looked at Ash on the floor, and at the cut in his side which had already nearly closed, and at Violet, white-faced beside him, and at the empty air where the rot had been, and he said, in the careful voice of a man who had served 3 kings, "What just happened?" Ash laughed.
It was a real laugh, weak and astonished, and it was the second most beautiful sound Violet had heard in 9 years. "My wife happened," he said. Cassara was tried 2 days later in the Great Hall, in front of the council and the visiting delegations, and as much of the household as could fit, because Ash had decided, with Violet's quiet agreement, that secrecy would only make her more dangerous. The vial was produced, the 2 dead men were named, and their paymasters traced back to Cassara's own household with the patient thoroughness of Sheldon, who had apparently been waiting for an excuse to investigate Lady Cassara's expense ledger for some months. Cassara did not speak in her own defense. She sat in the chair they had placed for her and looked at the floor with the flat, resigned face of a woman who had been raised from the cradle to be queen of somewhere and had finally understood that the somewhere was not going to be here. The council voted exile. Ash had asked for it instead of execution, and the council, who had spent the morning watching their king walk into the hall under his own power for the first time in over a year, had not argued with him. Cassara was put on a horse with her personal effects and a sealed letter to her father, and an escort of 4 guards who would see her to the eastern border and no further, and she rode out of the Hollow Moors in her red dress in the late afternoon and did not look back. And the gate closed behind her, and the keep, very slowly across the next hour, began to breathe. Violet did not attend the trial. She had not slept in 2 nights, and her body, which had held a weight no sin-eater had ever held in quite that way, was demanding payment. Bailey had put her to bed in the morning, with a cup of something dark and bitter, and a firm hand on her forehead, and she had slept for 9 hours, and when she woke it was dusk, and Moth was on the bed beside her, with his great bony head on her hip, and Ash was in the chair by the fire, reading a book she suspected he was not actually reading. He looked up when she stirred. He set the book down. He came to the bed and sat down on the edge of it and took her hand and held it without speaking for a long time. "The rod is gone," she said finally, to make sure. He nodded. "The rod is gone," he said. "The healers have looked. They do not understand. I told them not to ask. They are not asking." "And the cut," she said. He pulled the collar of his shirt aside. The cut along his ribs was a thin pink line, already half faded, the way a shifter's wounds healed when nothing was eating his strength from the inside. She put her finger on it, lightly. He shivered. He covered her hand with his again. "Violet," he said, "I am angry with you." "I know," she said. "You did not tell me what you were going to do. You stepped into a knife fight to do it. You held a king's worth of black rot in your bare hands for the length of a slow walk to a window. If your gift had failed at any point in those 40 seconds, you would have absorbed it all and died on my chest." "I know," she said. He did not let go of her hand. "I am also," he said, "more grateful to you than I have language for." "I know that too," she said. He laughed, just a breath of it, and lowered his head until his forehead was against the back of her hand. "Will you stop?" she said gently, being angry and grateful at me at the same time, "and just be here for a minute?" He stopped. He stayed where he was, his forehead on her hand,
and she watched the firelight move across the dark crown of his hair, and she felt under her sternum the slow, even weight of him, no longer rot-laced, no longer dying, only tired and alive, and hers. And she let herself feel, for the first time, that the thing she had built in her chest was not a burden after all, but a place she had been making, room by room, for a person to live in. They did not consummate the marriage that night. He held her instead, fully clothed, on top of the blankets, with moth across their feet, and she slept again with her ear over his heart, and the heart was steady and clean and uneaten, and that was, for that night, more than enough. They consummated it 3 nights later, in the same bed, after a long, slow afternoon of him bringing her things she had not asked for: a comb, a bowl of stewed apples, a small carved figure of a wolfhound with one ear notched that he had whittled himself in the back kitchen years ago and had never given to anyone, and a long, slow evening of her telling him every small thing she had not had a chance to tell him yet, including the thing about Bailey, the dying old man, and the way she still carried the mill pond in her chest, and probably always would. He listened. He did not flinch. When they finally turned to each other under the dark wool canopy, he was as careful with her body as he had been with everything else he loved, and he asked, more than once, if this was what she wanted, and she said yes, and yes again. And at the moment he marked her at the curve of her shoulder with the press of his teeth, slow, deliberate, asked for. She felt the bond between them lock into place with the quiet finality of a door closing on a house that was now warm inside. A week later, in the late afternoon, Violet was in the inner courtyard with Moth at her ankle and a small basket of bread crusts in her hand, feeding the keep's resident pair of fat gray doves who had decided the courtyard was theirs. The old ewe was still standing. It had not, as far as anyone could tell, died any faster from what it had taken. The hollow in its trunk was no darker than it had been before. Bailey, who knew about such things, said that ewes were patient about death the way they were patient about everything else, and that it would go when it was ready and not a day sooner, and that it had been honored to take what it had taken. And Violet, who had spent her whole life listening to the interior weather of living things, believed her. Ash came out of the side door behind her and crossed the courtyard slowly, not because he was tired, but because he had taken to walking slowly in places where she was, the way a person walked who had been given more time than he had budgeted for and was determined to spend it without rushing. He stopped beside her. He did not speak at first. He watched the doves. One of them landed on the rim of the basket and stole a crust the size of its own head and flapped off heavily toward the eaves, and Violet laughed, and Ash turned his head to look at her at the sound of it. And the look on his face was the look she would carry under her sternum for the rest of her life, beside Bailey, and the brother, and the mill pond, and the long, slow weight of him. "Doria sent a letter," he said after a while. Violet's smile faded. He felt it through the bond and put his hand at the small of her back, lightly. "She is not coming here," he said. "I had Sheldon write back. The debt was settled out of the auction price. She has no further claim on you. She wished, in the letter, to know whether you were well." "I am," Violet said slowly. "I am." He nodded. "I told Sheldon to write that. I also told him to add that if she wishes to see you, she may write again, and the decision will be yours, and the keep will neither encourage nor prevent it." Violet considered this. She considered Doria's candle held too high in the doorway, and the cracked basin, and the morning of the ash and the spoiled milk. She considered the woman Doria had become, and the sister Doria had once been to Violet's mother. She found, in the soft hollow under her sternum, that she did not yet know what she felt about any of it, and that not knowing was, for once, allowed. "Maybe in a year," she said. "Maybe not." He nodded again. Whenever, he said. Or never. The basket was nearly empty. Moth, who had been watching the doves with the patient interest of a dog who knew he was no longer fast enough to catch one and had made peace with this, leaned his great bony head against Violet's thigh and sighed. She rested her hand on his skull. She looked up at the old yew, 600 years of weathered patience, and a hollow heart and a king's worth of black rot held quietly in its roots, and she said, mostly to herself, I should bring it water. The healers say it's dying, Ash said. I know, she said. I'll bring it water anyway. He looked at her. He looked at her for a long time. Then he took the empty basket out of her hands and set it on the stones, and he put both his arms around her from behind, and he pressed his cheek against the top of her hair, and he stood with her like that in the late golden light, while Moth leaned on her leg, and the doves murmured in the eaves, and the old tree breathed slowly above them, and he said, very quietly, into her hair, Thank you. For what? She said, though she knew. For not running, he said. For not running, and for not swallowing me, and for finding a third door when both my people and yours had agreed for 1,000 years that there were only two. For moth on a rug, for a you that took what I could not give you, for being, against every rule I had been taught, exactly what I needed and nothing I asked for. Violet closed her eyes. The bond under her sternum was very quiet and very full. She turned in the circle of his arms until she was facing him, and she went up on her toes, and she kissed the crooked corner of his mouth that sat lower than the other, and she said, You're welcome. And then she said, Come help me carry the water. He laughed. He took her hand. They went together across the courtyard toward the well, with the half-blind wolfhound limping behind them, and the doves complaining in the eaves, and the old tree standing patient and hollow and honored in the late light. And somewhere in the keep behind them, a bell rang for the evening meal, and neither of them hurried. There's something about the moment she opened her hands at the window that I find really hard to shake. The choice not to swallow, not to be the kind of savior her bloodline had been built to be, and to trust instead that an old tree and a borrowed minute would be enough. If you were Violet in that moment, with a vial in the doorway and a king bleeding under your palms, and every rule you had ever been taught telling you there were only two doors, what would you have done? I'd love to know what you think. See you in the next story.